In the spring of 1952, in the Black Loam Farm country of northern Iowa, Glen Irwin stood at the edge of his east field with his father's old cedar pacing stick in his hand, counting rows the way his father had taught him, 1 notch for every 10 paces, and he did not yet know that a man named Roland Ashford, who owned the sprawling property adjoining his own, had already walked a surveyor out along that same fence line the week before and drawn a new boundary in pencil that erased 18 of Glen's best acres and folded them quietly into his own. The wrong belief that sat over the whole county that spring was a comfortable one, the kind people repeated at church suppers and feed store counters without thinking twice, that the courts existed to protect a small farmer's claim just as surely as they protected a rich man's, that paperwork filed in good faith would be honored, that 11 years from now nobody would remember this as anything but a footnote. Glen was 38 years old, married to Dorothy, father to 2 boys who were still young enough to think a lawsuit was something that happened to other families. He farmed 140 acres his grandfather had broken from prairie sod, and the 18 acres in question were the richest of the lot, a gentle south-facing slope that drained well, and had never in memory produced less than 40 bushels of corn to the acre. Roland Ashford's claim rested on an old survey from 1911 that he said proved the boundary had always run through what Glen had farmed his whole life as his own, and when the county clerk's office confirmed there were indeed 2 conflicting surveys on file, a circuit court judge issued an injunction freezing all activity on the disputed acreage until the matter could be resolved. Glen remembered standing in the clerk's office reading that order twice, then a 3rd time, certain there had to be some mistake, because the land had corn stubble on it from the fall before, his own stubble, his own labor, and now a piece of paper said he could not so much as walk a plow across it. Dorothy asked him that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, how long a thing like this usually took to settle, and Glen said he did not know, maybe a year, maybe 2, because neither of them could imagine that a boundary dispute over 18 acres of Iowa dirt could stretch itself out to fill more than a decade of their lives, could take him from a man of 38 with dark hair and steady hands to a man of 49 with a permanent stoop in his shoulders and a case number he had memorized better than his own children's birthdays. The cedar pacing stick had been his father's, cut and notched sometime before the First War, worn smooth at the grip from 40 years of pacing fence lines and marking planting rows, and Glen carried it that spring, not because he needed it for any practical task, but because holding it steadied something in him, a small worn piece of continuity in a season, when everything else had suddenly become uncertain. He did not know yet that Roland Ashford had chosen this particular year, this particular claim, with a patience that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with arithmetic, because Ashford had sat through enough county business to understand that a small farmer facing a wealthy neighbor in a drawn-out, legal fight was not really fighting a case. He was fighting a clock, and clocks favored whoever could afford to let them run. Ashford owned 900 acres outright, sat on the board of the county bank, and had a standing arrangement with a law firm in Des Moines that billed him a flat retainer no matter how many motions they filed or how many continuances they requested, while Glen would have to pay his own attorney by the hour out of harvest money for as many years as the case required. That spring, none of the town knew any of this arithmetic yet. They only knew that Glen Irwin and Roland Ashford had a dispute over a fence line, that a judge had frozen the land, and that everyone assumed, the way people always assume about disputes between a rich man and a poor one, that it would surely get sorted out fair and square before too long. The public humiliation came in July of that same year, at a Farm Bureau meeting held in the basement of the county courthouse, the kind of gathering where 40 or 50 men sat on, folding chairs to hear updates on grain prices and equipment loans, and where Roland Ashford, dressed in a gray suit that had no business being worn to a farmers' meeting, rose during the open comment period and addressed Glen directly across the room in a voice pitched to carry. He said he understood some men liked to farm land that wasn't rightfully theirs, and that he supposed it was easier to plant another man's slope than to work your own poor bottomland properly, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room because nobody quite knew whether to laugh along with a bank director or feel for the farmer he was needling. Mildred Fenwick, who ran the feed store ledger and sat near the back with her husband, would say afterward that she felt her face go hot on Glenn's behalf. And Otis Bramwell, who farmed 2 sections south of town, later told his own wife he had never in his life seen a man take an insult with less flinching than Glen Irwin did that evening. Glen stood up slowly, the cedar stick still in his coat pocket, from where he'd carried it all day without thinking, and he said only that the courts would settle the boundary and that he intended to keep farming honestly until they did. And then he sat back down, and the meeting moved on to grain futures as though nothing had happened, though everyone in that basement understood something had. Harold Dietz, Glen's oldest friend, a man who farmed the section just west of Glen's place and had known him since grade school, walked out with him afterward into the parking lot and said the thing everyone was thinking, that Ashford wanted a rise out of him and Glen hadn't given him one, and that this restraint would serve him better in the long run than any hot retort could have. That restraint became, over the following weeks, the shape of Glen's contrarian decision, the decision that would define the next 11 years. Rather than match Ashford's public theater with theater of his own, rather than spend money he didn't have chasing every insult through gossip and counter-gossip, Glen resolved to work the land he still had access to with a discipline so total that nobody watching could say he had let the dispute break him. He would show up to every court date the lawyer required, answer every deposition honestly, and otherwise say almost nothing about the case to anyone outside his own kitchen table. Dorothy worried this silence would be read as guilt, that the town would assume a man who didn't defend himself loudly must not have much of a defense, and Glen told her that a defense wasn't a performance, it was a fact, and facts didn't need volume, they needed time. Ashford, for his part, understood exactly what Glen was doing, and adjusted his strategy accordingly, instructing his Des Moines attorneys to file for continuance after continuance on procedural grounds, requesting additional surveys, additional depositions, additional expert testimony on soil composition and historical fence placement, each motion technically defensible, and each one adding months to a case that a more honestly argued dispute might have settled inside a single growing season. By the fall of 1952, the injunction on the 18 acres remained in place. The corn stubble from the year before had gone to weed, and Glen had paid his attorney $400 out of a harvest that had already been thinner than usual because he'd lost the use of his best ground, the first small installment on a bill that would eventually consume more money than the family had ever held in savings at one time in their lives. By the winter of 1953, Glen had made peace with the shape his contrarian decision would take, and it was this. He would treat the remaining 122 acres not as a diminished consolation, but as the entire farm, worked with the same seriousness he'd have given the whole 140, and he would let the 18 disputed acres sit exactly as the injunction required, untouched, unplanted, unclaimed by any action of his that a hostile lawyer could later twist into evidence of overreach. This meant accepting a real cut in income at a time when the family could least afford it, but Glen reasoned that any shortcut, any attempt to sneak a late season disking across the disputed line, would hand Ashford's attorneys exactly the kind of ammunition they wanted. Proof that Glen Irwin didn't respect court orders, and so he drew a mental fence tighter than the injunction itself, and never once crossed it in 11 years. Harold Dietz became, in this period, less a friend who offered advice and more a friend who simply showed up, helping Glen repair a hay baler in the cold of February, standing beside him at auction when equipment needed replacing, saying little about the lawsuit, because he understood by now that Glen didn't want to talk about it, he wanted to work through it. The mechanics of that work were unglamorous and specific. Glen rotated his remaining acreage between corn and oats on a tighter schedule than he'd used before, because he could no longer rely on the disputed slope to rest and recover while he worked the rest, and he began, almost as an experiment born of necessity rather than any grand vision, saving every scrap of manure from his 6 dairy cows in a covered pit rather than spreading it thin and fresh the way most of the county still did, because Dorothy's uncle, a retired county extension agent, had once mentioned that aged and composted manure held its nitrogen far longer in the soil than fresh spreading ever could. Glenn didn't yet have a name for what he was building toward, and the acres under active injunction, the 18 good ones, sat fallow and untouched, gathering weeds and losing whatever fertility they'd once held, a slow bleed that nobody in town paid much attention to, because slow bleeds rarely make for interesting gossip. The cedar pacing stick went with Glenn now on every walk of the remaining fields, marking where he'd need tile drainage repaired, marking the exact rows where oats had underperformed the year before, a small worn tool doing an old job in service of a new necessity. Ashford, meanwhile, had begun quietly working the disputed acreage himself that same season, on the theory, later disputed in court, that an injunction preventing Glenn from farming didn't necessarily prevent him, since he claimed ownership outright, and this created a second minor legal skirmish that added still more months and still more billable hours to a case that had already outlived any reasonable person's patience. By late 1953, Glenn's attorney fees had climbed past $1,000, and Dorothy had begun taking in mending work from 3 families in town to help cover the gap, careful never to let the boys hear her, and Glenn discussed the numbers after they'd gone to bed, because whatever else this fight cost the family, she was determined it would not cost the children their sense that the world was fundamentally fair, even while she and Glenn were learning, year by year, exactly how untrue that could be. The years from 1954 through 1958 unfolded with a grinding sameness that Glenn later found harder to describe than any single dramatic event, because there was no single dramatic event, only the accumulation of small losses that individually seemed bearable and collectively became crushing. Twice during those years the case was assigned a new judge after the previous one retired or was reassigned, and each new judge required a fresh round of procedural review before substantive hearings could resume, adding the better part of a year each time, through no fault or intention of anyone in particular, simply the ordinary friction of a court system never built to move quickly. Ashford's attorneys requested a full resurvey of the county's original 1911 plat records in 1955, a request that took the county surveyor's office the better part of 18 months to complete given their limited staff, and when the results came back ambiguous, both sides' experts offered contradictory readings of the same faded ink lines, and the case simply continued rather than resolving. Glenn's legal bill crossed $3,000 by 1956, and he'd taken a second mortgage on the farmhouse itself to keep current with payments, a fact he told almost no one except Harold, who offered to loan him money outright and was gently refused, because Glenn had a private conviction that borrowing from friendship the way Ashford borrowed from institutional power would cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. The weather cooperated with none of this. 1955 brought a dry summer that cut his oat yield nearly in half, and 1957 brought a wet spring that delayed planting on the remaining acreage by nearly 3 weeks, each setback landing on a family with steadily thinner margins and no 18 acres of reliable bottomland to fall back on. Secondary mockery crept into town gossip during these years in smaller, meaner forms than Ashford's basement speech, comments at the diner counter about how a man ought to know when to fold a losing hand, whispers that Glenn was stubborn past the point of sense, that Dorothy deserved better than watching her husband bleed the family dry over a matter of 18 acres that any reasonable man would have settled or walked away from years before. Otis Bramwell, to his credit, pushed back on this talk more than once at the feed store, pointing out that walking away meant admitting a boundary that had stood since Glenn's grandfather's time was suddenly, conveniently, wrong the moment a wealthy man decided he wanted it, but Otis's voice was one among many, and the many did not always side with patience. Glenn kept working. He extended his composted manure system that had begun almost accidentally in 1953 into something closer to a deliberate practice, building a second, larger pit, and had begun in 1957 on Harold's suggestion after Harold read a pamphlet from the Extension Service. experimenting with a lupin cover crop planted after oat harvest on a few test acres, a legume that fixed nitrogen into depleted soil through the winter months at essentially no cost beyond seed and labor. None of this touched the 18 disputed acres, which by 1957 had gone 5 full seasons without cultivation of any kind and had begun visibly reverting toward scrub, a fact that would matter enormously later, though nobody standing in that county in 1957 could have predicted how. The verdict came down in the late summer of 1963, 11 years and 4 months after the original injunction, in a courtroom that held perhaps 30 spectators, most of them there for other business on the docket that day, rather than any particular interest in a boundary dispute that had long since stopped being news. Glenn was 49 years old. He sat beside his attorney in a suit that Dorothy had taken in twice over the intervening years as he'd grown leaner, and when the judge read the ruling, citing the ambiguity of the 1911 survey, but ultimately crediting a 1934 amended plat that Ashford's attorneys had introduced late in the proceedings, a document establishing the boundary, essentially, where Ashford had claimed it all along, Glenn felt something that surprised him by its quietness. Not rage, not even shock, but a kind of exhausted recognition, as though a verdict he had privately feared for years had simply arrived on schedule. He had lost the 18 acres outright. The total legal bill, tallied by his attorney's office that same week, came to $6,200. Very nearly every dollar the family had managed to save or borrow across more than a decade, gone not to the land itself but to the process of arguing over it. Dorothy met him at the farmhouse door that evening and did not ask how it had gone, because his face told her before he said a word, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table where they'd sat so many nights over 11 years discussing motions and continuances, and now, finally, had nothing left to discuss, only a number and a loss to absorb. Harold came by the next morning without being asked, the way he always did, and found Glenn out in the yard simply standing, the cedar pacing stick in his hand, looking toward the 18 acres that were no longer his, now visibly overgrown after more than a decade without a plow, and Harold said only that he was sorry, and Glenn said that sorry didn't fix soil or pay lawyers, and the two men stood together for a long while without speaking further. The town, for its part, absorbed the verdict as confirmation of what the diner gossip had long predicted, that Ashford had simply outlasted him, and there was a strange, uncomfortable pity in how people greeted Glenn at the feed store that fall, the kind of pity that stings worse than open mockery, because it assumes the matter is already settled and finished. Ashford, for his part, did not attend the reading of the verdict himself, sending an attorney in his place, a small detail that Mildred Fenwick noticed and mentioned to her husband, that a man who had spent 11 years and untold resources pursuing 18 acres could not be bothered to appear in person for the moment he finally won them, as though the acreage itself had stopped mattering to him the instant it became merely a possession rather than a campaign. Glenn had 122 acres left, land he'd worked continuously through the entire ordeal, and a family that had aged through an entire decade of tension in what should have been the most productive years of a farmer's working life. And as autumn set in, he began, without any particular ceremony, to think seriously for the first time about what came next. The winter of 1963 into 1964 was, by Glenn's own later account, the quietest and hardest season of his life, quieter than any of the 11 years of litigation, because litigation at least gave a man something to wait for, some future date on which matters might resolve, while a lost case gave him only the flat present tense of what remained. What remained was 122 acres that had been farmed hard and unevenly for over a decade, while attention and resources went toward legal bills rather than soil health, ground that by any honest measure of its own history should have been performing better than it was, but had instead settled into a tired plateau, yielding around 18 bushels of oats to the acre, in a county where healthier land routinely produced double that. Glenn walked every foot of it that winter with the cedar stick, this time not to mark planting rows but to take stock, kneeling in the frozen furrows to crumble soil, between his fingers the way his father had taught him, noting where the earth held together in a dark, living clump and where it crumbled to pale, lifeless dust. Harold, sensing that Glenn needed a project more than he needed sympathy, brought over every Extension Service pamphlet he could find that winter, and the two men sat at Glenn's kitchen table poring over bulletins about soil biology that most of the county had never bothered to read, learning about biochar, charred organic matter that could lock carbon, nutrients into soil structure for years rather than washing away with the first hard rain, a technique Glenn began testing that spring using a simple earthen kiln. He built himself from scrap sheet metal, burning corn cobs and fence row brushed down to a fine black char. He then worked directly into his most depleted acres. He paired this with the composted manure system he'd already built over the previous decade, expanding it further, and added a third element that Dorothy's uncle suggested after. Hearing about the biochar experiment, a simple compost tea brewed from aged manure steeped in rain barrels and applied as a liquid soil drench that carried live microbial activity directly to the root zone in a way dry compost alone couldn't match. The fourth piece was the lupin cover crop Harold had introduced years earlier on a few test acres, which Glenn now expanded across nearly the whole farm, planting it immediately after each grain harvest so the legume could fix nitrogen through the fall and winter months before being turned under each spring. And to this he added, almost as an afterthought, born of pure frugality, collecting and diluting cattle urine from his dairy herd's holding pen as an additional nitrogen source, a practice some of the older farmers in the county still remembered from their grandfather's time, but had long since abandoned in favor of store-bought fertilizer. None of it cost Glenn meaningful money, which mattered enormously to a family that had just handed over $6,200 to attorneys, and all of it cost him labor, hours spent hauling char and brewing tea and turning cover crop under by hand and by horse-drawn implement long after most of his neighbors had moved fully over to diesel tractors, but labor was the one resource the 11 years of litigation had not managed to take from him. Word got around town, as word always does, that Glenn Irwin had taken to burning brush piles and hauling manure water around his fields like some kind of throwback, and the secondary mockery resumed in a lighter, almost affectionate register this time. Men at the feed store joking that Irwin had gone in for witchcraft farming since the lawsuit knocked something loose in him, and Glenn, true to the pattern he'd set 11 years earlier in that courthouse basement, said little in response and simply kept working. Roland Ashford, across the fence line, spent those same years farming his newly won 18 acres with the confidence of a man who considered the matter fully closed, planting corn and later soybeans in a straightforward rotation, applying commercial fertilizer at standard rates, running the operation the way most of the county's larger, wealthier farms ran theirs, competently and unremarkably. He had, in the years immediately following the 1963 verdict, become something of a fixture at county agricultural meetings, occasionally referencing the boundary case obliquely as an example of how patience and proper legal process eventually rewarded the party in the right, a framing that conveniently omitted the 11 years of manufactured delay his own attorneys had engineered, and few in the room contradicted him aloud, though Otis Bramwell would later admit he'd bitten his tongue more than once during those meetings. Ashford's confidence in this period was not unreasonable by the standards most farmers judged success. His combined operation, now including the disputed 18 acres, was larger than Glenn's entire remaining farm. His bank position was secure, and his social standing in the county, already considerable before the case, had if anything grown, since winning a decade-long legal fight against a smaller neighbor read to most observers as simple vindication rather than anything more troubling. What Ashford did not track closely, because he had no particular reason to, was the yield performance of Glenn's remaining acreage year over year, assuming, as most of the county assumed, that a farm that had spent 11 years starved of its best ground and drained by legal fees was a farm in slow, permanent decline, the natural and expected outcome of losing such a fight. By the harvest of 1965, 2 years into Glenn's soil rebuilding program, the results were still modest but noticeably upward, oat yields climbing from the 18-bushel plateau to the low 30s, corn responding similarly on the acres where biochar and compost tea had been most heavily applied, improvements Glenn attributed privately to the compounding effect of feeding soil biology consistently rather than chasing any single miracle input. Harold, watching these numbers climb season by season, began keeping his own informal ledger of Glenn's yields alongside county averages, partly out of genuine scientific curiosity, and partly, he admitted later, because he suspected the numbers were building towards something worth documenting. Dorothy, for her part, noticed the change less in numbers than in her husband's shoulders, which had begun for the first time in over a decade to unstoop slightly, and in the way he now walked the fields in the evening, not out of anxious habit, but out of something closer to satisfaction, the cedar stick in his hand marking not court dates and legal deadlines, but simply the height of a healthy stand of corn, or the give of good dark soil underfoot. By 1966, 3 years into the rebuilding program, the shift that had been invisible to the town for so long began, for the first time, to become impossible to entirely ignore. Glenn's corn yields that fall reached the low 60s, still shy of his eventual ceiling, but already comfortably ahead of the county average, and the difference showed most starkly in the physical appearance of his fields compared to his neighbors, the soil darker, holding moisture longer through the dry stretches of August, cover crop green, showing through stubble, in a way that made his 122 acres look, from the county road, distinctly different from the ground around it. Roland Ashford, driving past on his way to town one September afternoon, is said by more than one witness to have slowed his car along the road bordering Glenn's property, staring out at a stand of corn that by every visual measure outperformed his own adjoining fields, the ones on the disputed 18 acres he had fought 11 years to win, and Otis Bramwell, who happened to be walking the road ditch that day checking a fence post, said Ashford sat there long enough that Otis wondered if something was wrong with the car. Ashford said nothing publicly that fall, but Mildred Fenwick, whose feed store ledger recorded exactly what every farmer in the county was buying, noted that Ashford's account had begun ordering unusually large quantities of commercial nitrogen fertilizer that winter, well above his historical purchasing pattern, a small detail that in hindsight read as the first sign of a wealthy man growing uneasy about a neighbor he had assumed was permanently diminished. Glenn, for his part, remained as quiet about his success as he had been about his hardship, declining an invitation to speak at the county extension office's spring meeting about soil rebuilding techniques, a decision Harold questioned gently, suggesting other struggling farmers in the county might benefit from hearing what Glenn had learned, and Glenn's answer, that he'd talk when the results spoke plainly enough that nobody needed to take his word for it, revealed a man still cautious about drawing Ashford's attention any sooner than necessary. That caution proved warranted, because by the spring of 1967, Ashford, whether out of genuine agronomic curiosity or wounded pride at being visibly outperformed by the neighbor he'd spent over a decade grinding down, had begun making inquiries around the county, asking his own hired hands and even, according to one account Harold later relayed, sending someone to walk Glenn's fence line under the pretext of a routine boundary check, an arrogant overreach that assumed he still had every right to inspect what Glenn had built the same way he'd once inspected, and claimed Glenn's land outright. This was the overconfident public move the town would remember most clearly once everything came out afterward, because Ashford, unable to simply ask his neighbor a civil question, after 11 years of open hostility, chose instead to treat Glenn's soil rebuilding program the way he'd treated the original boundary, as something he might simply be entitled to, claim for himself if he pushed hard enough and moved fast enough, a habit of mind that had served him well against a slow court system but would prove far less suited to a dispute with no ambiguous survey lines to exploit. The harvest of 1967 delivered numbers that made the earlier improvements look modest by comparison. Glenn's 22 most intensively rebuilt acres, the ones nearest the old boundary where he had concentrated 4 straight years of biochar, compost tea, lupin cover crop, and diluted cattle urine, coming in at 89 bushels of corn to the acre, a figure that exceeded not just the county average, but exceeded, specifically and pointedly, The 76 bushels Ashford's crew reported off the 18 disputed acres that same season, the very ground the 11-year lawsuit had been fought over, now yielding 13 bushels less per acre than the smaller remnant Glenn had rebuilt from nothing while starved of resources and battered by legal fees. The county extension agent, compiling harvest data that fall for the annual regional report, flagged Glenn's numbers as remarkable enough to warrant a personal visit, and word of the comparison spread through the feed store and diner counter with a speed that 11 years of courtroom filings had never managed, because unlike a legal dispute, a yield number was a fact anyone could verify simply by looking at two adjoining fields side by side. Ashford's response when it came that winter was not the graceful acknowledgment some in town half expected, but a fresh legal filing, this one seeking, through an attorney's carefully worded petition, some form of access or compensation related to what the filing described as agricultural techniques developed on land whose boundary determination Ashford's own suit had helped establish, an argument so strained that even the presiding judge, according to the courthouse clerk who was present that day, paused during the hearing to ask counsel directly how one might go about legally dividing a method of thinking that existed only inside another man's head. A question that landed in the courtroom with an audible ripple of laughter from the handful of spectators present, several of them, including Otis Bramwell, having come specifically because word had spread that this hearing was worth seeing. The petition was dismissed within weeks, but the damage to Ashford's standing proved far more lasting than any court ruling, because the same county that had once watched him win 18 acres through sheer financial endurance now watched him lose something far less recoverable, the appearance of dignity, as men who had once laughed uncomfortably along with his courthouse basement mockery in 1952, now openly recounted the story of the judge's question at the feed store counter, turning Ashford's own tactic of public theater back against him in a form he could not out-lawyer or outweight. Glenn, when Harold told him about the courtroom laughter, said only that he'd never asked for any of it, the vindication or the audience. He'd only ever asked to be left alone to farm his land honestly, and that if the county wanted to draw its own conclusions from two fields side by side, that was the county's business, not his. By the following spring, Glen Irwin had become, without any deliberate campaign on his part, something of a quiet reference point for other farmers across the county quietly struggling with tired soil and thin margins, men who stopped by not to hear a speech but simply to walk the 22 acres and ask plain questions about the biochar kiln or the compost tea barrels, and Glenn, now willing at last to talk since the results no longer needed defending, answered them the same unhurried way he'd once answered Ashford's insult in that courthouse basement. Without embellishment and without bitterness, Roland Ashford's decline over the following years was not dramatic or sudden but steady, his standing on the county bank board quietly not renewed at its next term, his presence at agricultural meetings thinning until he stopped attending altogether, a wealthy man's slow slide into irrelevance among neighbors who had once deferred to him and now simply didn't think of him much at all, the natural consequence of a reputation built on leverage rather than respect once that leverage stopped working. Glenn never spoke publicly about Ashford's decline, never allowed himself the satisfaction of comment even when others raised it at the feed store, holding to the same restraint that had carried him through 11 years of litigation and 4 years of quiet rebuilding. A disciplined Dorothy once described to her sons as their father's true inheritance from his own